Good evening, everyone. I think we'll make a start. Welcome to this evening's common discussion, common talk. My name is Maggie Chapman. I'm co-convener of the Scottish Green Party, and I'm very pleased to be here as chair this evening. I hope to keep us all in order. I think what we have this evening will be a very interesting and hopefully a varied discussion. We're going to hear from our two speakers and then have discussion and questions from the floor. So please do get involved in that part of the discussion. Talking about the economy, talking about how we fund Scotland's future is high up on all of our agendas, I think, and of great interest to us, especially given what's happened post-referendum with shenanigans between Holyrood and Westminster, discussions around further cuts to come, changes, the plummeting of oil price, and then the picking up of the price slowly. All the while we try and think about how best we counter the austerity that so many people across Scotland are facing, and the pretty dire situation that many of our communities find themselves in. To kick off this evening, we've got two speakers, I'm sure, who will be known to you, Colin Hines and Richard Murphy. Colin is convener of the Green New Deal group, which consists of finance, tax, environmental and energy experts, all talking about exactly this kind of thing. And Colin is going to start off, and then we'll hear from Richard, who many of you will know from his writings, both around the referendum, but also in newspapers and loads of other forums across the UK. And we'll hear from each of them, and then, as I say, open it up to questions and comments from the floor. So, welcome to this evening, and Colin, thank you.
Well, the first thing to say is Richard and I are deeply envious of you. Because we come from a part of the country where there is political inertia and a deep sense of what's the point. Whereas here, one gets the impression there's rather a lot of energy and forthright optimism and organising, etc., etc. So it's very refreshing to be somewhere which is a bit lively. Politically, compared with somewhere which is normally, sadly, been rather moribund. But what we both really want to talk about is the question of funding. I'm sure you're all completely, I know I am, completely fed up. You see a politician comes on television, he or she is, very tight, on message, and says, right, we've decided that we're going to increase the subsidy for watered-down gruel for people over 80 in food queues. Immediately, the commentators say, well, how do you pay for it? How are you going to pay for that? How are you possibly going to pay? That's going to cost hundreds of millions. The politician then says, it's been carefully costed. We're going to increase the tax on the watering down of gruel for the under 80s, and there'll be a balance. And that kind of sterile debate about how can you possibly afford to pay for any of the things we want, you dare not say anything without having a carefully costed, absolutely 10 out of 10 institute of this and financial of that agreeing with you. So, Richard and I have been working for some years now to try and make clear that thanks to a complete panic after the economic collapse in 2007-2008, the concept of money is difficult to find was actually completely blown out of the water. In America, they had over $1 trillion of quantitative easing. In Britain, we printed, out of nowhere, £375,000 million. £375,000 million. Now, the idea behind this, it's laughable really, was this money would be used to buy government debt, and then money would flow in the economy, particularly via the banks, and then it would be invested in the real economy. Jobs, opportunity, all over the country. Well, of course, what actually happened was this £375,000 million predominantly went via the banks, through pension funds, insurance, etc., to blow up the assets of the stock market and increase the property values and various commodities all over the globe. It was not at all grounded in the real economy, and there was no mechanism for grounding it into the real economy. And so we thought, well, let's think of a new kind of QE, a new kind of quantitative easing, called green infrastructure quantitative easing. And imagine for a second a party saying, well, what we're going to do is to spend £50 billion a year training a massive carbon army to crawl over all of the 18 million dwellings and 2 million factories and public properties in order to make them energy efficient and have as much renewables as feasible. And that would cost eventually around £50 billion a year. Now, think of that for a second. If that actually happened, that would mean a vast range of new skills needed. From draft stripping, through to putting up PV, through to financial instruments, through to advertising, through to helping people deal with problems, plumbers, gas fitters, etc. But the most important thing about green quantitative easing is that it is jobs in every single constituency in the country. If you are serious about dealing and changing the energy system, and every single house, factory, hospital, etc. in the country, you're not talking about a 3-year project and then people are laid off. You're actually talking about young people having the potential for a career structure. People of my age having somewhere possibly to invest whatever spare money we might have had. You're getting a concept of intergenerational solidarity between money from one section eventually helping another section to work. But the most important thing about quantitative easing is it does not add to the deficit. It does not have to be repaid. It is basically one arm of government printing money out of nowhere and giving it through various mechanisms to another arm of government. In the process, if it was green infrastructural QE, you would be able to actually re-galvanise and re-energise the entire of the UK economy. Now, of course, that wouldn't be enough on its own. There are other things that need to be done, transportation system, etc., etc. But we started in the Green New Deal group with the concept of energy efficiency and changing the energy system because it actually does require work everywhere, all over the country. It's not like a big power station, it's not like a big road, it's not like a fast rail track. It's actually something that affects everybody. Now, this is important because a reason Richard and I wanted to come up here, aside from our envy of the political energy that there is in Scotland, it's important because it looks as if in a couple of months' time, whatever the political parties in Scotland want could well influence what Westminster has to do. And so we feel it's very, very crucial to make the point that a kind of policy that improves the infrastructure, that generates jobs, business opportunities, and helps protect the environment, and does not add to the debt, does not make future generations impoverished, is a very important message to get going within Scotland and to be internalised by all the parties up here. Because it's much more difficult at the moment in England to get any interesting debate going on at all. Because in England, going back to the gruel analogy, they are all totally obsessed with how much it will cost, how are you going to pay, which Peter are you going to rob to pay Paul. And so the idea that there can be huge amounts of money in order to actually generate a range of jobs all across the entire country at no cost is something that seems insane, but is actually true. And it's happening all over the world, not for good green infrastructure QE reasons, but in order desperately to try and keep the economies of the world going, but not in any kind of clear direction. So our basic interest in coming up here is to say, look, you can overcome this constant mantra of how can you afford to pay for things. And there are arguments and a way via quantitative easing, which has already happened. This isn't plucking a fantasy out of midair. As I said, there's been 375 billion. There's 125 billion a year for 3 years was spent. That's unbelievable amount, and that's £6,000 for every man, woman and child in Britain. Was spent, but not effectively. So, we hope that a debate starts in Scotland about this way of doing things, this novel way of doing things. Because if it does, then hopefully it can begin to influence the discussions that take place after the election. Because otherwise it looks as if we're going to be stuck with austerity light versus austerity brutal. Those are the choices. Because all of that concept is based on the idea we can't possibly afford to do anything too radical, whilst quietly forgetting what we did with quantitative easing and what is now about to be done with quantitative easing in Europe. So, risk of repeating myself, you lucky people, you live in a very interesting part of the world. I hope our ideas can at least begin to influence some of the debate here, so you can help us out down south, because we need help.
Thank you, Colin.
Let me plug myself in so you can hear me. Ha ha, he says. How does that work? Oh, it pushes on. Not easily. I should have done it slightly earlier. Let me begin. In 2002, I made the slightly odd career move. Senior partner of a firm of chartered accountants to campaigner. It's not very common. I haven't regretted it for a minute. But I've got to learn something over that time. Every single idea that I seem to have been involved in putting forward has been told, it's rubbish, it won't work, you'll never make it happen, nobody will ever understand it, nothing will come of it. That's what they said when we said we were going to target, that was John Christensen and I in the Tax Justice Network, large companies. We said we were going to put large companies that put use tax havens on the front pages of newspaper. Nothing ever came of that one. We said we were going to try to change the way the world saw tax havens, and nothing ever came of that one. We said we were going to draw attention to the fact that there was a tax gap in the UK, a lot of unpaid tax, and of course nothing ever came of that one. No, that's not true. Everything came of all of those. Lots of things happened. I remember in 2009 I was in the World Bank, a place I'd never expected to go when I was senior partner of a firm of accountants, but was invited to go and talk. And the managing director said, Do you know what? I bet you'll never get people on the streets campaigning for tax reform. And then we got UK Uncut and Occupy. It was beyond her imagination in 2009. By 2011, it was happening. In 2009, I was told by the UK Treasury, you will never in your lifetime, Richard, get automatic information exchange of information on people who hold bank accounts in tax havens. It will never happen. It starts in 2016. In 2002, I came up with the idea of something called country-by-country reporting, where multinational companies should publish a profit and loss account for every country where they trade. And I was told it will never happen. In September 2014, the OECD said every multinational company should do it around the world to supply to their tax authority. Not as yet on public record, but don't worry. Give us another few years, we'll get it there too. I'm saying all these things for a reason. It's not a bragging reason, it's just actually that good ideas at the right time in the right place can happen. I didn't know that in 2002. I met Colin in 2002. It's been an interesting journey. I'm not sure who it's been more interesting for, me or Colin. But it's been fun. But so many things that back then we couldn't even dream of have now begun to happen. And Colin and I first wrote about the possibility of revitalising economies through local authorities using borrowed funds, local authority bonds, in 2003. And at the time it was, yeah, that's ridiculous. It'll never happen. But now it's on the agenda. I'm speaking tomorrow to COSLA, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, on this issue. Why? Because they've asked me to come and talk about it. Your local authorities want to hear about what we're discussing here tonight. It's not now some mad idea on the fringes, which a few of us are talking about. It's moving to the mainstream. That seems to be possible in Scotland at the moment in a way that it isn't possible, I'll be honest with you, in England. If I try to raise this subject where I live in Norfolk, I think that the audience would be smaller than that in the front row tonight. It would not attract an audience. But you're vibrant. You've got this enthusiasm for change. And Scotland clearly doesn't accept something that we've never accepted, which is that austerity is not necessary. It's always been at the heart of the work that I've done. It's always been at the heart of the work that the Green New Deal group has done, that we have never needed to have austerity. Austerity is a political choice. The fact that people have suffered is a political choice. The fact that we've had cuts has not been because they were required, but because some parties wanted to reduce the size of the state. Well, I'm very happy to say I think government's a good thing. I think it works. I think some excellent people work for government. I think they're bright, they're innovative, they can do fantastic things, and some of them are also rubbish. But by the way, that's true of the private sector too. If you want some names of people who are really rubbish in the private sector, let's start with Lord Stephen Green, Fred Goodwin, and a few others. There's some really bad people who work for the private sector, and yet, I'm afraid to say, of course, some people who get out of bed on the wrong side in the morning also work for the state sector too. But the reality is they're all human beings who can deliver amazing things. But what we have been told for 35 years, and it is 35 years, because we can absolutely nail it down to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who came into office near enough at the same time, is that the state sector is useless. That there is nothing it can do that will ever be better than can be done by the private sector. Now, I find that really insulting. I find it really insulting that the person who drove our train up this morning, because Colin and I came up on the East Coast route today, was 2 weeks ago a burden on society because they were working for a nationalised railway, and now they are liberated to their full potential because they're working for Richard Branson. Well, okay, they're actually working for Stagecoach, but it doesn't matter. You say Virgin all over the train. They are the same person doing the same job, and they are just as competent now as they were 2 weeks ago. No change. Ownership doesn't matter. We can liberate people. And the point about what we've been doing, and I'm going to expand it a little bit beyond the Green New Deal ideas and the green quantitative easing, though I will very happily explore that in as much depth as you like, in as much technical depth as you want in the discussion, that there are so many ways that if we want to, we can find the money to actually deliver the social programs we want. And I'll tell you why we need those programs before I tell you how we get the money. I will show you the next innovation in the UK. It looks remarkably like that. That's an iPhone 4, we've had an iPhone 6, we're going to have an iPhone 7 next. It will do exactly the same as my iPhone 4 does, except this one's battery has nearly failed, so it's run out. Innovation is not happening in the private sector. It's not investing, it doesn't know what to do. But we do know that we need a green economy. We do know we need housing. We do know we need to get rid of the curse of PFI. We do know that we need to invest in young people. We do know that there is so much education that is not happening. We do know that we need improved social services. I can go on, and of course we need to green the economy and create the new technologies which could be the basis for Scotland's prosperity in the future if only tidal and hydropower and other things were made the basis for Scotland's future exporting. And all of those things can be done. All of those things can be achieved with money. Where does the money come from? I've got 3 sources of money for you. Not just 1, 3. The first is very obvious. We collect the money that is not owed by tax cheats. I've been saying this now for a long time, I admit. According to the government, according to HM Revenue and Customs, there is £34 billion of missing money in the entire UK economy, which still means there's a lot of missing money in Scotland. There is another alternative estimate of the amount of money missing, which is mine. There are only 2 estimates of the amount of money missing in the UK, which I find in itself an extremely odd thing. Why has no university ever been asked to research this question properly and thoroughly? Why is it left to me doing it in my back garden in Norfolk? Because it seems an odd source of excellence compared to the revenue, but we are the only 2. My estimate is 120 billion. I'll tell you it's wrong, because it's an estimate. By definition, it's wrong. I mean, it could be 105 and it could be 135, but it's something like 3 to 4 times bigger than the government says. Now, I'll give you one explanation as to why they get their number wrong. HM Revenue and Customs is chaired by the former senior tax partner at KPMG, who's the auditor of HSBC now. Odd that, isn't it? Very strange that we have a tax authority actually chaired by one of the firms of accountants that has been found guilty of criminal tax evasion in the USA and had to pay a fine of 456 million for it. But they aren't that keen on perhaps recovering tax as much as I am. But there is a vast amount of money out there. I believe we could collect 20 to 30 billion. That means 2 to 3 billion for Scotland at least, of extra money just by employing more staff. That's one way we can get more money. A second way we can do it is actually to look at one of the most absurd tax expenditures in this country that we have. In the UK, every year, we subsidise pension funds to the tune of around £40 billion. People who save in pension funds are, by definition, already well off. You've got to be well off to actually be able to save. Okay, some people are in low-paid jobs and working for local authorities, but the vast majority of people who will be having money paid into pension funds are already, by definition, well off. Because if you've got money over at the end of the week in the current economy, most people actually would consider you well off. And you've got to have money over at the end of the week to put money in a pension. So, we are giving a subsidy of 40 billion a year. Now, given that total government spending is 700 billion, 40 billion is quite a lot. It's over 5% of total UK government spending. And my suggestion is that in return for that relief, 1/4 of all money that goes into pension funds should be invested in new projects in the UK economy that create work. That would release 20 billion for investment in the UK economy. 20 billion. With your share, how many houses could that build in Scotland a year? Because you've got to do something and make people work. So pension funds can be liberated to create work in our economy. But the biggest idea of all, bigger than either of those, is our idea on what we're calling green infrastructure quantitative easing. We wouldn't have thought of this before 2008. If you look at our very first Green New Deal programme, which we published in July 2008, which was, of course, before Lehman Brothers fell over, we published our programme for recovery from the crash before the crash happened, which is sort of quite a nice, neat thing we can say we did. You know, we got in before it even happened. So our recovery programme was there, ready to be picked up. It's why even Barack Obama used the phrase Green New Deal when he was trying to get election in the States. You know, the name spread so rapidly. We didn't have this idea then, but green quantitative easing is, just as Colin has said, a variation on what the government's already done. The estimate is that to build sustainable economies which are able to generate their own power, to make sure that the planet does not heat by more than 2 degrees, we've got to spend £50 billion a year in the UK, year in, year out, for a decade or longer. It won't cost less than that. We've got to create alternative energy sources, whether it's solar panels, whether it's wind, whether it's tide, or whatever. We've got to invest in that. We've got to invest in energy saving. We've got to look at how we organise the whole supply of energy. We've got to look at our transport systems. We've got to rethink electric transport in a way to reduce carbon and so on. So we use renewable energy, not carbon energy, for transport and more. All of that is going to cost a fortune, and we don't pretend otherwise. 50 billion is a massive amount of money. But the odd thing is that our economy needs that 50 billion of spending right now, because people can't afford to spend enough, because people have not seen their incomes recover from 2008. Most people are not better off. GDP is higher, but there are several million more people in the UK than there were in 2008. So GDP per head is still actually, for most people, lower than it was. Most of us have got lower incomes. So people aren't spending much. Our export markets are not in great health, because our biggest export market is Europe, and they're not having a great time either. The private sector is not investing. The actual level of private sector investment is going down by a quarter at the moment, and therefore there is only one body left in the whole country who can actually change the economy around. There are only 4 ways you can turn an economy around. Consumers spend more, exporters buy more, the private sector invests more, or the government invests more. Those are the only options that are available in macroeconomic theory. And the theory is a mathematical theory, but it works. It's a complete closed system, in a sense, by including exports. If the first 3, exporters, consumers, and private sector businesses, aren't investing, then only the government can actually deliver the recovery that we want, which ends austerity. The Green New Deal, funded by green quantitative easing, can deliver that. We can actually do it. And there's a shortage of money in the economy right now. Now that sounds bizarre, because of course you all know that there is money around, but not apparently for what we want. And the way in which money is created is actually so obscenely simple that most people can't get their heads around it. If you don't know how money is created, most money does not look like, I know I've got a Scotch note in here somewhere, but anyway, that's an English 20 quid note. Money doesn't look like that. That isn't what money is. That's 3% of all money. The other 97% is electronic entries in a bank statement. That is created by people going into banks and asking for loans. Most people think when they go into a bank and get a loan, they're lent somebody else's money. I have to tell you, that's completely and utterly untrue. What actually happens is you go in and say, can I borrow £5,000 to buy a car? And they say yes, and they put £5,000 in your loan account and £5,000 in your current account. In accounting terms, and I am an accountant, so I've got to be really boring here. There's a debit, there's a credit, the books balance. They've just made if accountants aren't sure where the debits and credits are, by the way, they look for the window. This is really confusing. There's windows on both sides, and accountants really lost in a room like this because you can't have a window on both sides because debits are always on the window side, and now we've got one on the credit side. But what happened, you've got 2 entries in the books, both for £5,000. They didn't exist before you went in and asked for the loan, and if you decided to repay the loan immediately, do you know what? Those would cancel out and disappear again. There was no money before you went in. There was no money if you repaid it immediately. But because people trust that you can write a cheque or put your card down to buy your car or whatever with that 5,000 quid, you've got money. You can spend it only because you rely on the bank. But every single penny of the 97% of money which is actually in bank accounts is made by loans. But if people aren't spending enough, and exporters aren't buying our products, and the private sector aren't investing enough, there's not enough loans being made to keep the economy going round. That's why we needed quantitative easing in the first place, and that's why we need it again. We actually need this money. And by lending the money in a circle, which is how it is lent inside quantitative easing programs, by the government lending the money to one government authority who then has its debt repurchased by another government authority who then actually lends it back to the first person. It's just money going around in circles. You actually end up with a virtuous circle, and that money can be put to use. We are quite convinced that this economy could use 50 billion for the UK as a whole, and therefore at least 5 billion for Scotland. That could provide the investment to fundamentally change the future of this country. You could actually go out there and think, we're going to build an inheritance for our children. David Cameron loves saying we're going to leave our children the debt. No, we don't need to do that. What we need to build is a real inheritance, which is schools and hospitals and houses and energy systems and railways and roads. Yes, we do need some of them, but not lots. But we need some of them. And we need those things to leave to our children. And that's what we could do if we were willing to go out and print money. We could liberate ourselves to dream of a Scotland, of a whole of the UK, that could deliver prosperity and not austerity. In 1995, Richard Werner, who was then a virtually unknown lecturer in accountancy at Southampton University or in Tokyo for one period, dreamt up quantitative easing to save the Japanese economy. The Japanese economy has been kept going by quantitative easing. The US has continued to have growth when we've had no growth because they've done quantitative easing. Europe has finally realised it's got to do quantitative easing to just keep itself going because there's not enough money. We did it, as Colin explained. Now we need to do it again. But now we don't need it to keep our banks going. We need it to keep you and you and you and you and everybody else going. This is about taking ownership of the potential in our economy to liberate all of us to get on and live the lives that we would like. I believe that's possible. That's what we're here to talk about. That's what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow morning. Jim Murphy is going to be followed by Richard Murphy tomorrow morning, which I think is quite funny. The Murphyers in town in Crieff tomorrow morning. And I'm going to be probably offering a different story to that which Jim is going to tell. I hope I am, to be honest, because I want to talk about a different vision, not of what is not possible, but what is possible. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. Over to you.
Thank you very much both for that. I think, can you all hear me okay at the back? Yep, great. Over to you. Questions? I think we'll take a couple of questions, maybe, or see how we go. Yes. Two questions there. Do you want to take those two, or do you want to take a couple more?
If somebody wants to ask another one, we'll take a batch.
Yep.
One of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about generated $4.2 billion in debt and created a grand total of 6,000 new jobs. With the new administration, they raised taxes, they tripled the minimum wage, and put people to work. And in 2 years, created $4.2 billion in surplus and have created 167,000 jobs. I mean, there are lots of levers, and I think maybe just focusing on the government side of it is not quite enough.
Okay, I think that those are good questions to be starting off with. Which of you?
Shall I just do the last one? Should we do the other two?
If you wish.
Go on then.
Well, no, I mean, it's a good point. And I mean, one of the things that's very central to Green QE is the concept of adequately to well-paid jobs, such that people can pay adequate taxes, etc., and you can keep the whole thing going. You can get out of this downward spiral of less and less real economic activity. So I think that's one crucial area. The other area is that at this moment in time, and we're only looking at QE at this specific time, this moment in time, there isn't a big source of other money. The private sector isn't investing. The difficulty, going back to your first question, is there's a psychological block to imagining that you could actually buck the market in such a way as to give people what they really want. And very much the feeling in the Green New Deal group with green quantitative easing is it's the transition, if you like, to getting to a stage where we do have much closer to full employment, where people feel confident to actually start investing in that economy, because there's a lot of business opportunities as well as employment opportunities. So you can eventually pull in the pension funds and insurance funds and the personal savings, etc. But it's just at this moment in time, the global economy, or at least most politicians, are mentally arm-locked into imagining that somehow there isn't enough money. And so in a way, it's to get us over that hump into then a more, and you're quite right, a much more diffuse range of funding.
Isn't that the fundamental of what's going on, is that government wants the economy to appear broken so that they can implement an ideological agenda, and that government and we, the people, have bought into that same mentality that we need to get out of.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's why we keep banging on about the fact that there is no shortage of money. People have been actually, like when I was joking about the watered down gruel, it drives me crazy. Every time you turn on the Today programme or watch television, etc., always the media jump on whoever's proposing something. Where's the money going to come from? We don't have enough money. And that's why it's very, very important to counter that mindset and say, look, where was the not enough money when they printed 375 billion of it? So it's trying to change that approach.
Why hasn't this been done? Because we have a government that didn't want this to happen. I mean, bluntly. But it's not just the current government, if I'm completely honest, either. I mean, we have to be clear about it. I mean, the previous Labour administration was also not exactly a paragon of virtue when it comes to trying to achieve a state-driven idea of welfare. I mean, we have had this culture. Neoliberalism has invaded a lot of the Labour Party. It's dominated the Conservative Party. It's been a significant part of the Liberal Democrats. And there have been exceptions in all the parties as well, but they are exceptions in every case. And there has been this culture, literally, that government can't do. And actually, I mean, I wrote a book 2 or 3 years ago, which I'm talking about tomorrow, which is called The Courageous State. To even put the word state in the title of a book makes you look like some sort of alien being. You believe that the state can do something. I do believe the state can do something, yes. And in there I describe the contrast between the courageous politician who will actually use the resources that are available to them and the agencies of government when they get into office, and what I call the cowardly politician. And I gave some examples of some cowardly politicians in the book. I called them David Cameron, George Osborne, Nick Clegg, Danny Alexander, but I also went back and called one Tony Blair. I was casting the net wide and saying, these people, whenever there was a question, said the answer is, we can't do it, but the market can. And therefore, they came up with the idea, and they were pursuing what is taught in most universities, that always if you shrink the state, you create prosperity. That is taught at universities and has become the ruling dogma because they created mathematical models which never included the state in them in the first place. You can't actually build very effective mathematical models of macroeconomics which actually include much of a role for the state, let alone taxation. And money, by the way, doesn't even feature in most macroeconomic modelling, which is quite extraordinary, but is absolutely true. They just think money is a neutral agent. Yeah, of course it is. Completely and utterly neutral money has no impact upon society at all who has it. But it's this belief that the state cannot achieve a result which is so pervasive that whenever you need an answer, we sell off East Coast Route, we sell off Eurotunnel, we sell off or outsource, so we sell our hospital building off and it's PFI. We outsource a service. Everything possible is done to reduce the size of the state. George Osborne's desire to take the size of the state back to what it was in the 1930s is not driven by economic need, it's driven by the fact that he wants to do that. And it's also driven by the fact that I genuinely believe that most businesses really do have no clue how to make new money now. They haven't got another iPhone. The two most liberating inventions of the 20th century were not the mass car and the computer. They were actually the washing machine and the Hoover, because they changed lives more than anything else. They fundamentally changed the role of vast numbers of people in society. There is no technology that is going to have the same impact as the computer, the car, the Hoover, or the washing machine likely to be coming up anytime soon. The changes we need are actually within the services we supply to each other. And that is what the state can facilitate. But they don't want to do that. And because business doesn't know how to make money anymore, they're selling them off. Our services, which capture tax revenues to get a private benefit, handing the East Coast route over to private companies, hands over £1 billion of surplus, which we previously had, to at least in part go to Stagecoach and Virgin, which strikes me as absurd. So, real lack of will. I mean, that's what we're coming up against. We have to challenge. And if we have political parties, and there are political parties who are saying no to austerity, I think it's great that 3 parties with women leaders at the moment are saying no to austerity. The Greens are saying no to austerity. The SNP is saying no to austerity. Plaid Cymru is saying no to austerity. And I think that's fantastic. There is some cohesion amongst parties saying there is an alternative. And that's what we need. And that's why Scotland can have such a big impact upon the next Parliament, because it's the most likely source of the biggest block of MPs who are going to say no to austerity, and therefore have an impact. Can this happen only in Scotland? I have to tell you right now, no, it can't only happen in Scotland. If Scotland was independent, it could happen, but actually only if Scotland had opted to use neither the pound or the euro, but have its own. You'd have to have your own central bank, and ideally you'd have to have your own currency, which I think would have been by far the best option, by the way, but which nobody was willing to put forward.
That's not true.
Sorry.
We did.
You did. I apologise. It wasn't heard enough. Maybe. Certainly it wasn't heard south of the border enough that there was another option available. But that would have been the right option. Then Scotland could have done this, and actually could have used that power to actually reprice itself into what it wanted. So there was that option. Right now, this will inevitably mean cooperation with Westminster. But I think there's one thing we can be sure about after the election. There isn't going to be a majority government in this country. the chance that either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party are going to win 326 seats in Westminster come May the 8th is, to me, about as remote as me being French by then. It's not going to happen. I really am not going to become French by then. I've got 2 passports. I'm Irish and I'm UK, but I'm not going to become French. I have no reason to be. So, in that case, the fact that there's going to be a block of MPs from around the UK who are going to be saying no to austerity gives them an enormous power to say to any party who will listen to them, and I don't think the Conservatives are going to be blunt, that we will at least support you to form a government. But the price will be you think about how you deliver to us the option to end austerity. There's a bargain to be done here, and it is possible that green quantitative easing and the Green New Deal is the bargain to be made as a condition of supporting whatever Labour want if they are going to be the government, which I think is the most likely outcome. And I could be wrong, of course. I'm guessing. But I can't make any of the election arithmetic add up to a combined Conservative, Liberal Democrat, UKIP and Democratic Unionist total, which comes to more than anything about 315, which is not a stable parliament. So I believe it is possible that literally the negotiating power to deliver an anti-austerity agenda could be created, and innovative finance solutions of the sort we're talking about are possible. Could we collect 120 billion in tax? No. Why? It's a bit like, there was that thing in the Bible that says the poor will always be with us. We're always going to have some cheats. You're never going to stop people actually cheating. You're never going to stop, same as you'll never stop people murdering. You'll never stop people doing all sorts of offences. Some people are always going to be there cheating on the side. What we have to do, and the goal of any tax system, is to make it as hard as possible for people to cheat by persuading them as much as is possible to be voluntarily compliant. That is, they voluntarily put the right amount of income on their tax returns and pay the right amount of tax. Because you can never have enough tax inspectors to check everybody. If you did, you'd have the most enormous police state of tax inspectors. It's not possible. It wouldn't be reasonable. It would cost too much. So we have to accept there's a compromise. Actually, what the evidence shows from research, which is why I've spent so much time talking about transparency in tax, why I focused on getting multinational companies to publish which ones use tax havens and which ones don't. Why I came up with the fair tax mark, which SSE is the only quoted FTSE 100 company to be in as yet, because they actually have admitted which companies they operate in and where they make their money. Why we're focusing on that issue, why we focus upon tax havens and why we try and get information from them. What we're trying to do is actually persuade people to voluntarily put the information on their tax returns that they previously hid. In the US, research has been done which shows that if people know that the revenue are aware of a source of income that they get, there's a well over 90% chance that it will be put accurately on their tax return. If they have a source of income that they know the revenue don't know about, there's a somewhat less than 60%, and in some cases less than 50% chance it will be accurately declared on a tax return. It might be there, but it won't all be there, in other words. So they might be cheating some of it, and some of them just won't be there at all. So what we want to do is have as many information systems to try and persuade people as possible to comply, and enough tax inspectors, which is at least 20,000 more than we've got now. By the way, there were 90,000 tax inspectors in 2005, and there's 55,000 now with a plan to cut that to well below 50,000 in the future. So we're going to over halve the number of tax inspectors in a little over a decade. I want at least 20,000 back to collect at least 20 to 30 billion, which I believe is possible. Actually, once we've collected 20 or 30 billion, well, yeah, we might be able to collect some more. But frankly, let's not be too ambitious at the start. If you over-egg the cake, you're just going to not be considered credible. So I talk about getting 20 to 30. I believe that's entirely possible. And so, incidentally, do the unions who work for it. But then I'm accused of being biased because I work with those unions, so apparently I don't know what I'm talking about. Because if you work for a union, it's another one of those things. You don't know what you talk about.
Thanks. Yeah, over there. And then...
Don't you think we need a new Labour movement in the UK? Since the 1980s, we've all lost, and only a tiny percentage of people have gained. So how about joining up the parties who don't agree with
Just to repeat that question for those who didn't hear it, what's happened to the quantitative easing that's happened so far? Where's it gone? What's happening with the debt? I saw a question, one more question. Yeah.
Actually, Richard quoted the Bible a few moments ago about the poor will always be with you. The important thing about that, excuse me for being gory about it, is that actually just shortly afterwards it says, a big unless, unless there is Jubilee, unless there is the restitution of debt, unless there is the restitution of land and so on. And actually, whether you're religious or not, that's quite a helpful point, because I've just been reporting some of this on Twitter, and immediately someone comes back to me and says, but you know, if your credit card is maxed out, how can you go on spending all this money? You know, there are fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of money, the nature of the economy, what's possible and not possible, and so on. And that's true in public imagination, which creates the space or lack of it for alternative political imaginations. And so, really, my question is about how we begin to create those new narratives. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon's speech on austerity was one of the best speeches that a mainstream politician I've seen for a long time, and she didn't quite cross the ribbon because it was against austerity, but it wasn't really defining a different kind of agenda. I think there's an opening there, actually, from a number of parties and movements within Scotland. What strikes me is that actually those of us in different parties would have a huge common investment in looking for that alternative narrative and alternative policy, but we somehow need to cross that bridge, and particularly in public understanding of these issues.
Okay.
Shall I take the first one?
Okay.
Yeah, go on then.
Yeah.
The one thing that I think is quite exciting about the whole concept of green infrastructure, QE, the Green New Deal, etc., is that actually it's something which should appeal to an enormous range of people across a whole spectrum of politics. Because if you do actually decide you are going to improve the employment situation and the business situation and the investment situation in every single part of Britain, then it's not just the unions and the left and the Greens that will be interested in this, it's the small c Conservatives as well. People that believe, small and medium-sized business people, who also have been having not such a great time over the last 20, 30 years. So I think it's very important to put this within the context of this is something that's going to benefit the vast majority. I mean, when people, going back to your point earlier, when people talk about, well, if there's interesting election result, there'll be a conflict between SNP maybe and Labour, etc. I don't think so. If the SNP starts to talk about, or Scottish Labour start to talk about the necessity for green infrastructure, QE, jobs in every single constituency, 20 million buildings affected, a 20-year programme. Most people in Britain, all over Britain, say, I'll have some of that. I like the sound of that. But then, the wonderful thing, which I'll then leave Richard to explain, is you don't have to pay it back. It's not a debt in the sense of has to be repaid by a new government.
So you're going to leave me with the hard bits?
I am the bullshitter of the pair. He is an accountant.
This seems to be the nature of our relationship. What has happened to QE debt? I'll come to you after we've done the technical bit, Simon. When QE started, everybody said, oh, you're buying up government loan. That's what it is. It is literally the Bank of England buying back the debts issued by the Treasury. The Bank of England is owned by the Treasury, by the way. So it is the Bank of England effectively buying its own debt. It works a bit like this. I'm going to show you. It's that 20 quid note again, okay? When you do QE, you take the money out of that pocket and you put it into that pocket. And it's still mine. It doesn't matter whether it's in my right pocket or my left pocket. They're both mine. And that's virtually what it was. It's actually so offensively simple that, that example seems crass, except for the fact it's true. You are literally having a company, the Bank of England, owned by the Treasury, buying the Treasury's debt. Or it's like, if you think, two people who live together with a bank account in common, and they owe each other money, and they say, okay, I'll write a cheque on our joint bank account to you to pay my debt, and I will pay it in again, and there's no more money than there was before, but you've settled the debt. I mean, it is the same sort of thing as that. So technically, when the Bank of England started buying the Treasury-issued debt, all it was doing was buying its own money back. But the consequence was they put 375 billion into financial institutions who had previously owned that debt. So that was the new money, and it was created out of thin air by doing that two-bank account trick. That's how they did it. At first, they didn't even admit they'd done the two-bank account trick.
Do you want to come back on that?
You said when Frank mentioned £5,000, it just creates an IOU and money. It's like the Bank of England did that.
Yeah, except they did it for 375 billion, yeah.
With the government, but the debt was with the government, so it just made...
So what they did was they actually, to make it work, they had to have another company owned by the Bank of England, because they couldn't do it for themselves. So actually, the Bank of England set up a new company, which it lent the 375 billion to. So it put 375 billion pound in that new company's, but it owned it, in that new company's current account, and it put 375 billion in its loan account. And the new company went out and bought back the debt from pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and others who owned it, which then put the money into the financial markets, which is what kept the financial markets going when there was a very real risk in 2009, 10, 11 that they would all fall over because there wasn't enough money going around. Now, when it started, they said, but that money will have to be repaid one day. It is going to have to be paid back. And then 4 years into the programme, and they said it's got to be repaid back because otherwise we will get massive amounts of inflation. Inflation will skyrocket because just like when in 1930s Germany they started printing money, then there was massive inflation, and when Zimbabwe has printed lots of money, you get inflation running at thousands of percent. We've printed 375 billion pounds worth of money. Therefore, we'll get enormous inflation in the UK. Has anybody noticed the latest inflation figure for the UK right now? It is, I think, something that looks remarkably like that. It's about 0. We don't have any inflation left at all. In fact, without having printed that money, we would have had deflation. And deflation is really dangerous. We've been brought up, all of them, almost all of us, there might be somebody old enough to remember a time when we didn't worry about inflation, but frankly, most of our lifetimes, everybody's been obsessed about the problem of inflation. And I can remember my first ever job had inflation pay rises every few weeks because I was in Ted Heath was Prime Minister at the time. And there were all sorts of inflation measures in place. I'm that old. And everybody was obsessed that inflation was going to ruin us. Well, actually, we haven't seen that level of inflation since the 1970s. We've had very moderate rates of inflation, and we still got worried about it. Now we realise that if we have deflation, it's much scarier, because when we have deflation, people stop spending, because they realise that if I need something new, it will be cheaper in a while, so why spend my money now? And business stops investing, because it realises that actually it's going to become more expensive. What's more, it's very difficult to have negative interest rates. Actually, some countries are now trying them out to see if they can actually charge people to put money in the bank. Switzerland is now actually running negative interest rates. If a company in Switzerland wants to deposit money in the bank, they actually have to pay for the privilege of doing it, which is quite extraordinary, because they've got such a serious deflation problem. But it's any interest rate in a time of inflation goes upwards. And of course, if interest rates go up, then in practice people stop spending because they've got to spend more on interest. Their mortgage becomes more expensive. So if you have deflation, your mortgage will always become more expensive. So deflation is really bad news. So we actually need to print money to stop us having deflation, because that will lead not just to a minor recession, but potentially to a depression. So we were in a position, what we've learned is that printing 375 billion was only just about enough to stop us getting deflation. And what's happened to that 375 billion? It's sitting on the balance sheet of the Bank of England, exactly, by the way, as happened in 1914. There's a precedent for this, where debt was bought and never repaid. In 1914, every bank in the UK would have failed because they had so many investments in Germany. And German investments weren't a good bet in August 1914. I'm reliably told. I wasn't around at the time. The Bank of England stepped in and bought all their investments in exchange for debt. They never repaid that debt. It just sat on the balance sheet forever. Never bothered to repay it. We don't have to repay it because there isn't any pressure to repay it. Now, at first, people didn't believe that. But by 2012, the 375 billion had given rise to the government paying to this subsidiary company of the Bank of England over 40 billion of interest on the loans that it owned by then. And George Osborne said, this is ridiculous. I'm running a government deficit to pay the Treasury to keep on earning money, interest, which it isn't using. So he said, no, thank you very much, I'll have all that back. Which did, of course, prove that actually it was his money all along, because he could demand it. And then he said, I'm not going to pay interest on that debt anymore. Well, if you stop paying interest on debt, what's the debt then becomes? I'm going to it's working really hard for its money tonight. Becomes one of those. There's no interest on owning that. I can own that 20 quid note from now until the day I die, and I'll never earn a penny's interest on it if I keep it as money. So by the fact that he cancelled the interest payable on 375 billion, he turned it from being debt, because debt earns interest, into money which doesn't earn interest. So he monetized it. Now that's been very rarely recognised. It's officially still not recognised in national statistics. When Osborne and Cameron want to scare you by saying we're leaving this massive mountain of debt to our children, they always say there's 1.5 trillion of debt in the UK, which is 1.5 for 12 noughts after the end of it, for those who are really interested. If you ever want to put it into your calculator, you put 12 noughts on the end of 1 to make a trillion. You've got a calculator big enough. I had to buy one in the end. It's part of the price of working on government finances is you have to have a calculator with a very big load of noughts on it. You can get them. But actually, the debt isn't 1.5 trillion, it's about 1.1 trillion, because nearly 400 million of it, 375 billion, is actually not debt anymore, it's money. And money doesn't have to be repaid. If you read what it says, I'm going to go back to this again. It says on here, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £20. Now, you can do this more easily, actually, than we can in England, because you can walk into the Royal Bank of Scotland or somebody else and say, come on, give me 20 quid for my note, please. And do you know what they'll do? If you go in and demand, I want £20 for my note, they'll say, thank you, there's £20. Hang on a minute, that looks remarkably like that one. It is that one. There's nothing behind it. It's just money. That's what it is. It's just a promise to pay. There's nothing more to it. There's no interest in it. There's nothing else. It's just money. And that is what that 375 billion has become. It's money. And what we are saying on green quantitative easing is it would be exactly the same. 50 billion a year could be printed as new money. You wouldn't have to pay interest on it. You wouldn't have to repay it. But you would provide the extra money that the economy needs to keep going. We might even create some inflation again, which actually makes the economy much easier to run and makes everybody feel better, because most people like having a pay rise rather than not having a pay rise. Everybody feels better if they think they might get a pay rise, even if it's only to catch up with where they were before. So having actually some inflation really works for us. But we've got to believe the story, because we've been told, most of us, for most of our lifetimes, that inflation is a terrible thing, we must be frightened of it, and that actually government economies work just like the corner shop in Grantham that one of our prime ministers once had her dad run. Margaret Thatcher believed that the UK economy was the same as a household economy. And that's where your maxing out the credit card idea comes from. You know, Cameron says that. You know, oh, let's change the medium. Let's have a co-op bank card. I could max out my co-op bank card if I wanted. Actually, they keep on increasing the credit limit. I'll never get to the credit limit because I'm far too cautious to ever do anything stupid like that. But you can't max out the credit card if you're a country, because if you've maxed it out, you can print another one of those to pay it off. You can actually physically print pounds if you really want to. There's nothing behind that. It costs about 10p to print, and it's worth 20 quid. So long as somebody thinks it's worth 20 quid, it works. So long as you believe that is £20, that is £20. So you can't max out the credit card because you can actually always print some more money to pay off the debt if you have to. You might eventually get inflation. We have suggested very clearly that if the time comes that the economy is going so well that we have full employment, not underemployment as we have now, all the 0 hours and enforced self-employment, and the people who are on benefit sanctions if they don't take any work that is offered to them under any circumstances whatsoever. No, real jobs paying at least a living wage. And we are absolutely getting everybody the job they want. And the economy is beginning to show signs of real wage increases because there's a shortage of labour and people are bidding up prices. So then we couldn't do quantitative easing because the economy wouldn't need new money. We'd have to stop. We'd just go and conventionally borrow it. We might even need to take some heat out of the economy, which is why the government does borrow at that situation. But until that happens, we can do quantitative easing, because we are running way below our capacity. But in terms of what's the answer to what happened to that money, it's just sitting there, it's money. It's just literally a 20 quid note, except there's 375 billion of it, no interest paid on it, no interest earned on it, it's just going to sit there forever, like a 375 billion pound deposit in the Bank of England. Fantastic. Sorry? In the Bank of England. It's just in the bank, it belongs to the Bank of England though. They own it. Where did the money go? The money went into the financial markets. The consequence of that was, of course, quite negative. It was deliberately put into the financial markets because we were so worried that the banks were going to fall over. The difficulty was that in October 2008, and this is why Alistair Darling bailed out the banks, that you could have put one of those into the till at Tesco's or wherever, and it wouldn't have worked because there was no money in the bank. The bank would have literally, there would have been no confidence left in the bank. Your card wouldn't have worked. So they had to put money into the banks to make sure that we kept confidence in the banking system. That's why we bailed the banks out. Because we couldn't literally have had people sitting there saying, I can't buy food. I mean, I'll quote my wife on this one. In October 2008, I was so worried that weekend that we were going to actually not have banks working by the Monday that I went and bought an awful lot of tinned food. Because I knew roughly what was happening in the Treasury that weekend. I got a pretty good feel for it. And she said, why have you done that? I said, because I know full well that if on Monday you can't buy food, you'll go start stealing. Because you're a mum, and you'll do anything to feed your children. And you won't care. If it's a matter of steal or feed my children, I'll steal. And that would have happened all over the country. We would have had civil breakdown. On average in this country, there are 9 meals in people's store cupboards. That's roughly 3 days' food. After 3 days, the country is hungry. Without money, after 3 days, complete civil breakdown. End of absolutely civil society, chaos, anarchy, troops on the streets. That's why they had to bail out the banks. That's where the 375 billion went. What's the impact of that 375 billion? House price increases in London and the area, because all the bankers are in London and the area. So that's where all the money went, maybe a bit around Edinburgh, but otherwise nowhere else. What else did it do? Why is the stock market at record highs when the economy isn't? Because the money's all been recirculated into things like shares and commodity prices. So complete waste of time. But we have to tell, and actually, Simon, you're absolutely right. What we have to do is tell a different story. And it is about literally telling stories. I mean, I'm often, Colin just describes me as an accountant. Well, actually, do you know what? Accounts are works of fiction. They're not works of fact. They are works of fiction. It's how you tell the story that matters with the numbers you've got available to them. And what we've got to do is tell better stories about numbers and about how numbers can work to our advantage and not to other people's advantage. And we've done that. I mean, if I look at, I started off telling you about things which I didn't believe would ever happen. I've read some of the election manifestos coming up. Half the Labour Party's election manifesto appears to have been borrowed from my blog.
Only half?
Only half, I'm afraid to say. They admitted that. I was in the Labour Party HQ last week and they did say it's only half. And some of the other stuff is rubbish. Personal opinion, of course. Rather more than half of the Green Party's tax policy is borrowed from my blog, if I'm honest. I've seen the draft. It's heavily footnoted as Murphy, tax research, Murphy, tax. So, I mean, a lot of the Green parties is, I've just seen what the Liberal Democrats are saying at the moment, and all three of their tax policies appear to have started on my blog. Country by country reporting, I invented it. We're going to spend more money on HM revenue and customs. I've started to been talking about it. I've sort of started that whole campaign. And the other one, we're going to crack down on tax havens. That's something that I've been involved with. So, you know, they've nicked the ideas. If you tell a story often enough for long enough, and you've said I've written a few words. I've written 3.5 million words on my blog in the last 8 years. That's storytelling in big scale. Every day, 3.7 blogs a day on average are produced by me. It was 4 by 8 o'clock this morning before I went off to get the train to find him. 4 blogs before 8 this morning, because I'm telling a story day in, day out to change the narrative. And that's what we still need to do. That's what we're trying to do. That's why we're up here. We're here tomorrow. I'm here tomorrow. Colin's meeting the SNP in the morning. I'm going up to Perth, and we're going to be talking about the different story we can tell.
Okay. So, some other questions. Aaron, and then Peter. I'll come to folk, yeah.
Related area which you're talking about. So one, with the idea of the deal, it's very much designed to meet the need of switching over to renewable energy to try and reduce climate change. But the other way of looking at that is the fact that it's not just providing the renewable energy, but we have to stop digging out the ground the fossil fuels. And there's currently a lot of talk about the need to shift our investments away from fossil fuels and take out our money from these fossil fuels and put them into investing in renewables instead. So I was kind of wondering your opinion on that idea of, there's an awful lot of money invested in these fossil fuel companies that could be put to other uses already. And that actually helps not only investment in renewables, but stopping continued exploration of fossil fuels, which was last year around £60 billion worldwide. And then my other question is something that I just popped in my head. You talking about green infrastructure, and often nowadays you come across that term in relation to natural capital, and the idea that there are assets found, and the nature of the world, so forests or peatlands or whatever, and a lot of the idea of carbon trading falls into that category. So again, touching on what Richard was saying about the fact that companies and financiers are finding that they're running out of ideas of how to create new profits. It seems to me, in my mind at least, that these new financial innovations in terms of natural capital assets are exactly designed to fit that purpose, which is that they're trying to create this fictionalized entity so as to create a new way of making more money. And I was again wondering your attitude of that, is what you think the consequences of that would be in the real world.
Okay, thanks.
So can I come back to this point about changing the narrative? Because it seems to me it's not just putting forward different policies, it's tackling some of the concepts that lie behind them. You mentioned the one about governments being like household budgets, which is wrong. But other things people are told every day are that government debt is a burden on future generations, that government deficits are bad things rather than just being an outcome of the sectoral balances of the economy as a whole. And those ideas are intuitively plausible at a very deep level. If we can't get people past that point conceptually, then the policy arguments become very difficult to make. I wonder if you've got some thoughts on how we challenge some of those deep-seated concepts that have taken root.
Okay, and one more, the guy in the blue. Yeah.
Discussion was having with my mate last night down in Liverpool, and his argument against, I was arguing more or less what you were saying, was that we just don't have the productivity here anymore. We've got kind of on the board by countries like China, basically on productivity. And his idea was the only way to change that was go to something to make them work. I said, well, that's maybe going a bit too far. But that was his point of the recent financial advisor.
Oh, right.
Okay, well, I'll take 1.5.
Some, and you'll leave me the rest.
On the questions of fossil fuels, when we started the Green New Deal group back in 2007, we could all see that there was going to be a massive credit crunch, which was going to give us a real potential for a change, a bit like Roosevelt's New Deal emerged out of the problems then. Hence, I'd stuck green in front of it. But we figured that the only way you could actually get people to support this idea was if they felt that it was going to mean more jobs locally, more business opportunities, etc. And so that's why we went down what is often seen as rather tedious, energy efficiency, and whereas much more zazzy to have large-scale renewable things, much more fun. But actually, what we thought was going to be crucial was to work out a way to inject a lot of economic demand into something positive, rather than economic demand into something negative. And so, in the process, start to say that going down this route rather than the fossil fuel route is not just, by the by, nice for the environment, is actually the way to rebuild your local economy. And so, in a way, we weren't really involved that much in the energy debate. We were trying to get involved much more in the jobs and economic activity debate. And I think it's an important distinction between when people are very concerned about the growth debate. My argument is always what you should be dealing with is economic activity, which in turn reduces the throughput of carbon, raw materials, minimises adverse effects. And so that was basically our thinking then, and remains the thinking. I mean, on changing the narrative, which seems very, very stuff that seems common sense, etc. I mean, I really do think that to take Richard's sort of take out the notes again. I mean, this is a very crass narrative, a Harry Enfield narrative.
Has that one seen the light of day before, Colin?
But it's actually loads of money. There's loads of money, and there is loads of money. When the powers that be want to save something, the money is not a problem. We want to save our economy and our kids' future, and the money is not a problem either. It's there. The difficulty is, and one of the narrative problems is, you have to constantly reassert, we've already done this, 375 billion. There's plenty of money, but it went to the wrong things. We know what we need to do. We know what conditions need to be improved, what things need to be improved. So I think it does constantly come back to fighting this idea that there's no money. I mean, in a way, that's the narrative that's got to be challenged. And you do it by saying that we know there's lots of money, because that's what they say. Europe is about to spend €1 trillion on quantitative easing. That's not some fantasy. That is going to happen, and it's going to make things worse. It's going to increase property values, particularly in London. It's going to reduce the value of the euro, hence make our exports more difficult. And it's going to pump up stock markets, which are absurdly great. So, it's the narrative that there's lots of money. It's not a problem. It's just got to be spent on something that really benefits society, rather than spent on something that benefits the few. And sadly, I don't think there's a quick way of doing that. It's just like, here's 3 million words and something. You just got to keep banging at it. But the advantage we have is that it has happened recently. 375 billion, about to be €1 trillion. This is not, some tiny little pilot scheme on the edge of somewhere. This has been a massive putting of newly created money to the wrong ends. And next time, let's spend it properly. Green infrastructure QE is what we think is one first step.
I have to admit that I said something before this evening started, that I had a goal for tonight. I wanted to have my 25,000th Twitter follower. Whoever you are, thank you. I started the evening with 24,992, and I've now got 25,001. Yay! Right, thank you to whoever, whether you're watching or whether you're here. Fossil fuel investment is a nightmare scenario. It is where the next economic crash is going to happen. Because fossil fuel companies, let's call them Shell or BP or whatever else, are one of the biggest part of the stock exchange and are one of the biggest parts of most private pension funds as a result. And they are valued not so much on the value of what they make now, but on the value of their reserves. So they have to keep finding new resources that they can dig out of the ground, potentially to sustain their values. That is why they are worth as much as banks. If they don't dig that out of the ground, and there is no way they can dig it out of the ground if we are going to keep the world to a 2-degree temperature rise, even if we're going to keep it to a 4-degree temperature rise, which will be a nightmare scenario, they still can't dig it out of the ground, then those companies are massively overvalued, and so is your pension, and there's a misallocation of resources. The money is in the wrong place. The markets have got it all wrong because they think that we can burn fuel forever, because they think that the externality called temperature is something that can be dealt with by some form of market mechanism, like carbon trading, which is a complete fiction because carbon trading has not stopped 1 penny of carbon being produced. It has merely created a lot of money for people who buy and sell what they call carbon reduction, but which actually hasn't reduced any, and which is therefore another excuse for some people to make a lot of money in a hedge fund or something somewhere around the world. So actually what we are potentially facing is the next global financial crisis, but it won't be a bank. It will when we realize that the reserves of these companies, that literally what we valued as if they can dig it out, can't be dug out, and then those share prices will crash. You heard it here first. Go home and feel miserable. Sorry, no. But there is a real problem coming our way. And that is one reason why we do now need to invest in alternatives, so that when actually that is realized, that there is something else that we can rely on, which we can work at, because these companies are going to be in trouble. Now, that may not be such bad news for Scotland in a way. You haven't got as much oil as you thought you had. But somebody in the world is definitely going to have that problem. So in a strange way, it might be that Scotland has had the best years of oil. I'm trying to put a humour aside to what looks like a pretty grim scenario. Look, the opinions vary. I mean, Jerry Leggett, who I think is one of the world's experts, let's be blunt, on peak oil, reckons we might have already had peak oil. We can't get any more oil. We've got to actually use less oil. In terms of actually what we can burn, we simply cannot burn the 40% extra carbon that is forecast to be required to sustain world growth assumptions from now until 2030, because we are going to fry our planet. It's not just, my children I need to worry about. I'm going to still be alive by then. I'm not that old. We are going to see a world which is unsustainable if we keep doing this. So we are in deep trouble. And that realization is becoming more apparent. I mean, anybody who follows The Guardian is now realizing that they have picked up this theme and are producing articles which say it's got to stay in the ground. It will have to stay in the ground. There is no way around it. But we're valuing it as if it's going to come out of the ground. And that is going to create the most massive financial shock when we realize that those companies are misvalued.
And the other thing is that the Bank of England now is beginning to say the same thing and beginning to look more at what role the Bank of England could have in environmental issues. Well, we've got a very good suggestion for them. Green quantitative. The green infrastructure QE. So, because those things that Richard's just outlined are getting so now in your face, then there is, you have to hope that things could shift very quickly. If they don't, well, you just hope they do.
We've done some practical testing on whether green QE is possible. For example, both Colin and I work quite closely with Caroline Lucas, and have done over, she's been a member of the Green New Deal group throughout its history. And one of the things that Caroline did was, when we were first thinking of this idea, she wrote to Mark Carney as Governor of the Bank of England and said, could you buy something other than government gilts as part of quantitative easing. And he wrote back and said, if the government said yes, we could buy other bonds. In other words, the sort of bonds we're talking about, the Bank of England could do it. All they need to do is be given permission by the government to do it, which also shows that the Bank of England is completely subject, by the way, to government control, which proves that this is all just money going round in a circle, all under common ownership. Where else do we go? Changing the narrative. How do we overcome this problem that government debt is this burden on future? Well, we actually just have to change the language in first part. I mean, again, I never used to think you could do this. And I've discovered you can change the language. And I'll give you an example which I've done. I mean, the word tax haven sounds a bit exotic and a bit exciting. You know, and it has this image of palm-lined beaches, which is rather nice. I've been to a few of them. I'm not always very welcome in them. But there's some which are very much unlike that. You go to Liechtenstein and try and look for a palm-lined beach. It's actually one of only 2 countries in the world which is double landlocked. In other words, it is surrounded by countries which are themselves landlocked. So it has not got a palm-lined beach anywhere in sight. But nonetheless, that's the impression. Exciting, exotic. And what we realized was that we needed to change the language. And so we created and defined a term called secrecy jurisdiction, which makes it feel as though it's all rather sordid and rather nasty. And it's deliberately created by the government. You know, we put jurisdiction in there. It's all about abuse of the law. And we started using this term in about 2008-9. First, inside the tax justice movement, there was a big debate. Could we change the language? Now, if you go to somewhere like the OECD, which is the organisation in Paris that sets the rules for world tax, you will hear the term secrecy jurisdiction used by officials as often as you will hear the word tax haven. The 2 terms have virtually become the same in the space of only 5 or 6 years. You can change the language. So, for example, instead of saying we're going to leave our children this burden of debt, we talk about leaving our children the inheritance they deserve of the assets and the economy from which they can prosper. But if we don't spend the money, we're not going to leave them the infrastructure, the resources, the technology, the ability, the know-how that they require to go forward into the 21st and 22nd century. So we have to talk about the fact that the debt is going to be used constructively, if there is debt, to create an inheritance. But there's also, we actually have to shatter this idea of debt, in a sense, because debt is a 2-sided thing. I'd explained, you create debt with 2 bank accounts. One side is the money you can spend, the other side is the money you owe. Every debt is owed to somebody. So, in fact, every single pound of government debt is owned by somebody, and for them it's an asset. Do you know who the biggest owner of government debt is in this country? No. Pension funds. Government debt is the basis of all private pension payments for people once they're retired. If there was no government debt, all private pension funds in the UK would collapse. They would have nothing to buy to provide the annuities on which they are all fundamentally reliant still, even after the pension reforms in April. They will still be absolutely dependent. In fact, there is a shortage of what are called AAA quality debts, which they can invest in to provide private pensions into the future, because people like me and him are retiring. The baby boomers are now retiring, and we want our pensions. And some of us have got some private savings, and they're turning into annuities, and you can't supply those without enough government debt. So unless we create enough debt, the whole private pension industry is going to collapse. So we're not creating something which is a burden on society, we're creating the thing which actually helps old people live in some degree of comfort if they've saved for their long-term pension savings. But no government minister has ever said that to you, have they? That if we repay all this debt, actually pensions will fall flat on their face. But they will. So we have to change the story and look at what debt is used for. Who owns it, and why is it useful? So it's that sort of story we have to begin to tell, which just gives the other side of the story very often without even reinventing the wheel. Productivity is an absurd notion. Productivity is measured as the amount of labour input compared to the amount of any other input. Broadly speaking, productivity is labour versus carbon. If China puts in too much carbon, or underpays its people so they're living in virtually slave labour conditions, then they appear to be highly productive. If you really want us all to live like the Chinese do, in an economy where actually most children have never seen a star, because it's so smoggy all the time that they can't see the sky, or you want to live in the sorts of level of income that they earn, then you could have what they call a productive economy. Only an accountant could come up with a description that China has got a better economy than us because it's more productive, because they're actually literally opening a coal-fired power station every 2 days. Now, that's absurd, but actually it doesn't matter. And do you want to know why? Because we've got our own currency, and they've got their currency. And so long as each country has its own currency, if you have a change in relative productivity, suppose they became just as productive as us and with the same level of wages as us, and they were genuinely more productive, then we would have to do what Italy did from 1945 until it joined the euro, which was devalue the lira every year and carried on smiling and kept on living, and everybody was happy, and it all worked because they simply devalued their way to keep themselves in the economy. So long as you've got your own currency, productivity balances out as to what you want to do. You are empowered to make your own decision on how long the working week is and how hard you want to work in your own economy. Because most of us are only worried about ourselves compared to our next door neighbour, not to China. Most of us have no clue what happens in China. I've never been there, have you? No? No, so you've got no real understanding of, keeping up with the Joneses in this case, or whoever it might be in China, it doesn't really matter to you very much. So actually, we just need to worry about productivity inside our country and equality inside our country, and we can balance it so long as we have our own currencies, which is why I would go back to that point. Scotland, if it had been independent, would have needed its own currency, because then all of those debates would have become irrelevant, because it could have managed the crises that came its way by repricing itself into work. So productivity is... Not if you actually are going to do a pound-for-pound exchange on it. So if you run an Edinburgh pound, a Scottish pound, the same as we've got a Bristol pound, for example, it wouldn't work if you insisted it is transferable directly back into the pound. You would have to be willing to let it deflate against the pound to make it work, if there was some reason why that was necessary over time. But it's technically possible, but actually, I assure you, if it became really effective, it would be outlawed overnight by the government. That's what happens when parallel currencies become effective. They're outlawed. I'm afraid that's the history throughout humankind. Right from back, by the way, from the time of the Old Testament onwards.
Okay, I think we've got time for probably just a couple more questions.
Because I've got to go up to Perth next tonight.
I'm really keen to hear from some more women. I've got 2 women here. Yeah.
You talked about tax evasion earlier, which is illegal. Tax avoidance is legal. Would it be feasible to have all those tax loopholes in the income tax system, and if so, would there be any adverse effects?
I've got another question. I thought I read quite a bit about the economy, but I actually have to admit, after listening to your stories, is, my idea about what money is, I can understand DC electricity, but AC/DC. So when I'm dealing with the bank, it treats my money as DC. But when the bank is dealing with the government and everyone, it's very AC/DC. And it makes me think, well, why bother paying tax? Why bother paying tax? Because they can just dish out money anyway. So there's no problem with this. Why do you bother paying tax? Why don't they just spend all that money? So this has been being logical. This has been having a conversation with my next door. If they said that to me after this
Thanks.
But ACDC is very important.
And
Well, I was wondering, I found it fascinating this evening, but I was wondering what I do now, like when I leave the room. And I'd love to hear from both of you an idea of sort of just one simple thing that each of us could do as individuals, as voters, or something to try and move this anti-austerity thing forward.
Okay. Taking the last point first. Join Friends of the Earth's efforts to get green infrastructure QE up on the agenda in Scotland, because as I said right at the beginning, the reason Richard and I are up here is because there's a real potential of change in Scotland at this moment in time. So if you are in any way connected with any kind of movement at all, then try and make sure that there is the concept, there's plenty of money. We've done it before. Green infrastructure quantity easy. That's a very important thing to do over the next couple of months in the run-up to the election. It really is, because it's a very bizarre moment now with the potential balance that might exist after the next election based on what the political class in Scotland and the people who hustle them actually decide on. So that would be my advice in the very short term. In a way, that's why we came up here to ask that. Help us in England. We need a lot of help. We do. Things are bad down there.
We're coming.
Thank God, the 7th Cavalry.
Are you leaving me the rest?
Yeah.
Okay. What do we do about tax avoidance? Put accountants out of business. That's the answer to that one. Look, actually, you have done something really intelligent about tax avoidance already in Scotland. One of my bizarre ideas was that we should have something called a general anti-avoidance principle. In 2009, I persuaded a Liberal Democrat MP, one of the guys from Liverpool, that this was a good idea, and he persuaded Vince Cable it was a good idea, so it got into the Liberal Democrat manifesto, and I thought, well, that's interesting, and that won't happen, will it? But then they went into coalition with the Conservatives, and in a few days they wrote a coalition agreement. And when I read it, damn it, my idea had got into the coalition agreement. And in 2012, they actually had to fulfill it. And George Osborne, much against his better judgment, appointed me to the committee to help write it. It took him a long time to agree. In fact, it managed to miss the budget because he took so long to agree that I could be involved. But because it was my idea, they did eventually appoint me. But we ended up with a daft one in England. The English version of the General Anti-Avoidance Rule requires the permission of the tax profession before HM Revenue and Customs can use it. So you go to the cheats and ask them, can we stop this cheating? And they say no, and say you can't. Thankfully, your Parliament last July passed a Scottish General Anti-Avoidance Rule, which does not require you to go to the tax cheats to go and ask for permission first. So you have a vastly better anti-avoidance rule already. And what your rule says, and which our English rule should say, but doesn't, because I couldn't manage to persuade them in the end of the day, is if you put something into a scheme which is only there to save tax, we ignore it when we come to assessing the tax. So basically it says you can try all you like to get round it, but if you put in something which is obviously just there to save tax, we won't let you do it. Now that has no impact upon your saving in an ISA, no impact upon you putting money into a pension, no impact upon you claiming the personal allowance, no impact upon you claiming the genuine business expenses that you incur if you're self-employed, because those are all obviously intended by law. What we're looking at are the loopholes. Tax avoidance is about using loopholes in a way the government didn't intend. Things like the film of partnerships, which have been so notorious and had so many well-known names in them and things like that. And actually, what we would really need is an even stronger version of that law now, because the one in Scotland isn't good enough. And actually, the Liberal Democrats and Labour are both saying, and the Greens, are all saying that actually they will move from a rule to a principle, which is actually what I always wanted. So in fact, principle is actually looks at the intention of the parties, not just the documentation. So you try and work out from the emails they wrote beforehand to their accountant saying, I don't want to pay any tax, can you find a way to make sure I don't, to see that that was what they were really trying to achieve with it. And if that's the case, then they don't get tax relief. So that is the way you deal with it. And what's the consequence of beating tax avoidance? The consequence is that a lot of accountants will actually go out and have to do something useful, rather than sit around dreaming up some very useless tax avoidance schemes, which are an attack on society. And that would be good news as far as I'm concerned. Why bother paying tax? I'm writing a book at the moment which has got the answer in that. Seriously, a whole chapter of my new book. My new book's called The Joy of Tax. Tax is the second most interesting three-letter word in the English language ending in X. Mix is obviously the most important. But yes, I'm writing this book called The Joy of Tax, and a whole chapter is dedicated to that very issue. If we can print money, why on earth do we have tax? Well, actually, there's something else to know about tax. Governments don't ever tax you to pay for government services. Now, that's a bit of a revelation to most people. Governments spend money and then reclaim it from you. Do you know, if you go back into deepest, darkest histories, kings didn't save up money in their piggy banks until they got enough to go to war and then said, who shall I go to war with now? They said, no, the French are over there and I'm going to fight them. Or something like that. They always went to war first and then worked out how to pay for it afterwards. And that's the way government spending works. We always spend first, and actually tax is reclaiming the money they've already printed and spent into the economy. And the reason why we have to tax is to actually stop too much money being printed. Because if you printed too much money, you would get runaway inflation like Germany in the 1930s and in Zimbabwe in the 1990s and Nigeria as it's tried every now and again. So taxing is actually about balancing the economy. It's not about paying for government services. You can pay for all the government services quite literally by printing money. You don't need any tax to do that. And in some countries in the world, that is what happens. Because they've got so much oil revenue, they don't need tax, for example. So they just literally use the money they earn from oil to pay for all the government services, and they don't raise any tax at all. Indonesia pays for 2% of its government services with tax and 98% with oil revenues. But we don't do that. So we have a government that spends a lot of money and then has to reclaim it. Otherwise, the economy would get out of balance. And that's actually the true story. So yeah, AC-DC's got even more complicated now because it's DC-AC, not AC-DC. You got the wave in the wrong cycle. And the waves actually are the other way around from, again, what everybody expects. So I try to explain all that in The Joy of Tax. That's one of the heavier chapters, I have to admit. There are some lighter ones, but not many, really. I think once you go beyond the title page, it gets a bit heavy, but, you know. Apparently Waterstones are queuing up to get it, and I can't even find the time to finish it at the moment. They think it's going to sell quite well with a title like that. I hope they're right. It's got a good publisher. It should be out in September. That's the target. And if I get round to stop writing blogs and other things like coming up here, I might actually finish the book. What do I do now? You actually, every time you hear somebody on the radio, on your local phone-in program saying, but there's no money, the credit card is maxed out, phone up and say, but there was 375 billion for the banks, so why can't we spend 50 billion on investing in the economy this year for the benefit of real people by building houses, greening the economy, creating the hospitals, ending PFI, creating new jobs? Phone in. I'll tell you, one of my regular slots in life is on the Jeremy Vine show on Radio 2. I actually was meant to be on it today, but I was somewhere in Northumbria, and they don't like mobile phones, so I couldn't do the Jeremy Vine show from there today. And you know, they have a real shortage of people phoning in, except the right-wingers. They are really, really short of actually sensible people. So if you phone up with a sensible comment to almost any phone-in program you'll get on air, just phone up and say, the credit card isn't maxed out because we can print some more money, or it isn't maxed out because we could print 375 billion to save the banks, so why can't we print a bit more to actually create the jobs for our young people that we need to make sure we've got a future in this country? And we didn't have to repay the 375 billion because actually they've cancelled it. Didn't you know? There's no interest paid on it anymore, so it must be now money, not debt. We're never going to repay it, so why can't we do the same now for this? Just work out a simple script. We've got materials on blogs and things. You can do that. You can do it. There's enough money to go round. Phone in. Argentina's still going though, isn't it? Is there a closed sign on Rio de Janeiro? Oh, no, that's Brazil. No, is it closed? No, it isn't. I mean, it did have a debt problem, but that was because it did overprint. I mean, there were all sorts of problems with Argentina. You can't do it forever. That's why you have to tax to reclaim the money you've spent. You've got to keep the thing in balance. So there is a fundamental role for the Treasury to make sure you don't run too big a deficit for too long, or else there will be people who say we won't buy your debt anymore. But actually Argentina ran through all sorts of political problems with regard to changes of governments, old debts, new funds trying to reclaim old debts, and all sorts of political issues which were sometimes historical legacy. But no, even then, Argentina's still going. It hasn't, literally put up a closed, we've gone home for the rest of the year or whatever else. It does still function.
Thank you very much, Richard and Colin, for that. Before we show our thanks to them, I just want to hand over to the Policy Director of Common Weal, who's going to say a couple of words.
Thanks. I'm the master of triple booking myself, so unfortunately I was off chairing another debate earlier this evening. My name is Peter Colin, the Director of the Policy Unit at Common Weal, and I'm here to tell you that we desperately need your money. We can't do it our own, and we need to keep going. This being a church, there's some collection baskets. Katie, where are they? They're over there. They're at the back.
To make them feel guilty.
It's been great having Richard and Colin speak, and thank you to Maggie for chairing. And we must get Richard in a taxi and get him to Perth or Crete or wherever it is he's actually going to, so that he can get a good night's sleep before wooing Cosla tomorrow. Wooing Cosla
With a few blogs written before, I probably get to do that.
Excuse me, what is your blog? What's it called?
Tax Research UK, but if you just put Richard Murphy into Google, I come up first. When you've written that many blogs, you come up first.
An architect.
There's an architect in Edinburgh. You might just get the local guy.
Yeah.
I hate him. He sometimes beats me. But I normally come up first. But sometimes it's Richard Murphy. I don't mind Richard Murphy, the poet. His work is brilliant in Ireland. But the architect, I'm not so sure about.
I was meant to be finishing the meeting, but as you can tell, Richard does like to talk. Thank you all very much for coming, and obviously it will be... sorry, Matthew.
Sorry, I just want to say that we put around an attendance sheet, and obviously somebody will ask, well, what do you do next? And we can't guarantee to provide you with all the answers, but we will tell you if other
we'll
things
get back in touch.
happening, and
Yeah.
keep in touch with you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you all for coming, and do be generous.
And can we say thank you to Colin and Richard?
Thank you.